Thank you. How's everyone doing this morning? Yeah, good. Good snacks back here. Hey, Elizabeth. I'm like, man, I know I'm in a room with great realtors when there's like very cool outfits and wonderful snacks. I showed up a little late and started wandering around looking lost, and now I have a whole bag of like incense and chapstick and like all these goodies I've been using over here in the corner. So thank you. It is a treat to be here to talk with you. Jeff is absolutely brilliant. It is really cool. I feel like I always get to hang out with him in the green room and not actually see him do his thing. So great to hear from him. And I am such a fan of Jessica's, so I hope you all are able to stay on for her. I thought maybe before jumping into my slides, it might be helpful to give a little bit of context for those in the room who might not know we have a Federal Reserve office here in Nashville, or might have questions about like why on earth is the Fed here in Nashville. So I lead the Nashville branch of the Atlanta Fed. So the Federal Reserve is actually the only central bank on earth that has this pretty unusual quasi-governmental structure. So the Fed was, do we have any Hamilton fans in the room? Has anyone seen? Yes! Childhood hero. So the current central bank we have in this country is actually the third iteration we've tried. And there's like something that the American public feels really squeamish about, the idea that there's an entity where we concentrate power over our money in. So the country has like tried a couple of different iterations. The current one has been around since 1913 and is this mix of public accountability. So the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., our governors are nominated by the U.S. President, confirmed by the Senate, and accountable to the Government Accountability Office. So there's our public sector perspective, and that's balanced out by regional presence around the country. And the idea is that when it comes to decisions as important as monetary policy, you maybe want to create what sometimes can be slower, what sometimes can be messier, but a democratic process where voices are not just embedded in private sector community and also not just embedded in Washington, D.C., but there is kind of a conglomeration of voices, of perspectives that represent a variety of views across the country. So the Atlanta Fed is the kind of portion of the Federal Reserve that I work with. I have been with the Fed. I started as a baby. In June, it will have been 20 years. And I am actually stepping down from my role in June and am really jazzed to have Emily Mitchell, the new regional executive in Nashville. I've been working with her for many years and am just could not be more thrilled about her leadership. The team jokes, I joke, and they all just kind of cringe that Emily's never going to have an easier job than when she can step into my role and realize that oh wait, I've been doing all of these things already for years, much better than Laurel. So please meet Emily before you leave. She's fabulous and is going to continue on this work, I know, in a really powerful way. But my role here, so the Fed does a few different things that were assigned to us by Congress. We regulate banks and think about broad financial security. We facilitate payments, so manage the physical supply of cash in the country and also operate the kind of electronic rails that electronic payments move on. That's all really important. But the hot stuff that gets me up in the morning is monetary policy. So unlike fiscal policy, which is the power to tax and spend that elected officials have, monetary policy, I like to think of it as the Fed is given exclusive rights by the US Congress to set the price of money in this country. And we do that by influencing the federal funds rate, or I think of it as kind of the base interest rate that all other interest rates in the economy are set off of. Everyone in this room knows this, I'm sure, very intimately. Mortgage rates, corporate borrowing rates, credit card rates, all of this is essentially a premium on top of the federal funds rate. And so we try to set that, and Congress has, so this is not something that the Fed comes up with on our own, but Congress has given us an explicit dual mandate say, use this tool, impact the price of money, to try to balance two factors that historically have been in conflict. So try to create a strong employment market. We want as many people as possible in this economy to be employed. That's never really going to be. I don't think it would be healthy if we aimed for a 0% unemployment rate because, as you know, when you move to a new community or graduate from college or go through a life transition, it's natural and healthy that there's some portion of the population in any given time that's looking for a job. But we want that to be a group of people that is looking for a job and is going to find one relatively quickly. So we want to try to create a strong economy with strong employment, but also keep inflation low and stable. And this is something that I is very near and dear to my heart. I spent the first half of my career really focused on inflation research, and it's kind of, I don't know, creepy maybe, that now finally, for the first time, everyone wants to talk about the thing that I've been wanting to talk about for 20 years, that it's no longer is inflation just a conversation in some weird back room with government economists, but the person in my checkout line wants to talk about inflation, and on the billboard, it's, buy your hot tub now because of inflation. And I think, wow, finally, also, ouch. So inflation, so how are we doing with these two things? How are we doing with our two objectives? Employment, man, honestly, it feels incredibly strong. If anything, it feels a little bit too strong still. I think labor markets have cooled down a little bit over the past year and a half, 2 years. But for the most part, if you are someone out there with skills, you are ready to work, you're looking for a job, you're willing to do hard stuff, you're going to find a job. Inflation, it kind of got to a place that was pretty uncomfortable during the pandemic. I mean, it was something that my team and I really expected to be fairly temporary. As we were going out and about, listening to business leaders, listening to consumer groups, getting a sense of how were people actually experiencing inflation, how were they responding to it. Early on, following COVID, our expectation was, okay, this is a blip. It's because of supply chains. It's because of some temporary COVID factors, but it should sort of sort itself out. And it didn't, or it hasn't yet. We've fortunately started to see some progress on inflation in the recent months, over a year now, but we have a little bit further to go. So I figured I would. I mean, I'm an economist, so I can just drown you in slides, which I'm always tempted to do. So I'm going to do a little bit of that, but my hope is that I can kind of speed through this fairly quickly, and then we can open this up to discussion, because I'm here because I love talking and thinking about things, especially inflation. But really, I just want to be of value to you all. So this isn't for me to kind of push a particular perspective, but instead, let's make this a conversation. I would love to hear, in particular, is there something I say that doesn't make sense? Am I talking about stuff that you think is actually not the important stuff to talk about? What is on your mind that you think should be on my mind? What am I getting wrong? So there will definitely be time for questions in the end, but it's more fun for me, and I suspect it's more fun for folks in the room if, as I go, if you have feedback or questions, just throw something my way or shout, or I'll try to see if you raise your hand and participate, because it's pre-lunchtime. What is it? Mid-morning. Feel free to get up and get coffee, get some chapstick, whatever you need. There are a lot of great things back there. Okay, snapshot of the economy. This is any economist, if you were to ask me, in my dreams, what is your one picture you would look at to say, okay, how are things in the U.S.? This is the first picture I would probably show. This is GDP growth, gross domestic product. It's just kind of a general cut of all goods and services created and or sold in the economy in a given period of time. So you can look at the red line is overall GDP growth, and whoa, was this last quarter wild. I mean, this is in some ways like one of the kind of most unusual times that we've seen. So what I've done here, just to break it down, what I've done is you have all the things added up, make the red line, but I've actually broken down percentage point contribution to that point in every quarter. And so the 0 is the middle. I don't know if this is too small for people to see, actually. So but basically, the story here is net exports were a huge drag to economic activity in the first quarter. Why is that? Net exports. So when we sell things abroad, so whether that's we actually physically ship goods abroad, whether we have consultants selling services abroad, it also counts as exports when foreigners travel to the US. That counts as exports. That is a plus for GDP in a given quarter. And when we purchase things from abroad, that is an import, and that takes away from GDP. So what happened in the first quarter? Tariffs. So people thought tariffs were coming, and so what did they do? They bought everything they need for the rest of the year. So we had this kind of wild pulling forward of activity in the first quarter that looked like, especially not just everything they need for the year, specifically things that they thought would be impacted by tariffs. And so you saw this huge drag on GDP growth in the same period. But guess what? A lot of that was offset by that same spending shows up in another portion of GDP, investment. So you have businesses that buy chips, that buy buildings, that are investing in both structures and equipment, software. You saw a huge boost in that activity, so that's in addition to GDP. So you saw the minus yellow plus gray that mostly counterbalanced itself. What I want to point out here is actually where I think the meat of the story is when I'm looking long term. I think a lot of this kind of first quarter distortion is going to end up working itself out through the year. It's mostly a timing issue more than a kind of real demand issue, in my opinion. I think a lot of the real story here is this dark blue portion. This is consumer spending, and anybody who argues that the American consumer is the engine of the American economy, I would have a lot to say to them, because it has been just absolutely remarkable how resilient the economy has been over decades. I would say in particular in the period following COVID, the strength of American consumption has been incredible. And I think in some ways, I mean, I don't know if you all remember a year and a half ago, the number of private forecasters who were expecting we would be going into recession in 2024. I mean, it got to a point where it was like all of the big famous economists, all the folks who work in the big investment banks and the big forecasting shops, for the most part, were saying, oh, there's a really high probability of a recession going into 2024. So what my team and I do, what Emily and I do here in Nashville, so our responsibility is to give guidance to monetary policy. So to have a perspective about what's happening in the economy, not just based on data. So we do that, we crunch numbers and do forecasting and kind of all the stuff you would expect. But we actually spend most of our time out and about in the community, sitting down, having conversations one-on-one with folks who we think have special or interesting perspectives on what's happening in the economy. It's why Jaron and I are on speed dial with each other. This was a really interesting period for me, because I would go out and I would sit down, I'd sit across from a CEO or someone who makes stuff in the economy, and I'd be like, okay, we're used to doing this, tell me what's going on, what are you worried about, how's business? And the number of them who would start the conversation saying like, well, we're going into a recession this year, so I'm getting ready for it. And okay. What are you doing? Well, I'm leaning up my employee base. I hired a bunch of people. I would just kind of hire anybody who would apply for a job and show up on day one. In the years following the pandemic, the labor market was so tight. So I kind of was overstaffed. I'm thinking about how I can lean up my operations. I'm investing in productivity, I'm investing in technology, I'm thinking about how I can kind of buckle up and prepare for a downturn. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, whoa, why? What are you seeing that's making you think that things are going into a recession? Oh, and the answer would be like, oh, well, not for my business. It's just everyone knows we're going to go into recession. Like, my pipeline's great. It's just, a recession. Haven't you seen it in the newspaper? And I would leave and be like, oh, okay, interesting. And it's funny, when you add up everyone's story, I think sometimes it can be easy to forget that, like, the economy is actually just all of us, right? Like, the economy is not some separate thing that's dictated by some fancy people somewhere else, but like all of the businesses who were saying, oh, I think we're going into recession because someone said we're going into recession, but like my business is doing great. Turns out all those businesses doing great are the economy. And we ended up seeing economic growth last year slow a little bit. But for the most part, the description of that slowing was something like normalization or stabilization. There was just unsustainably strong demand in the years following the pandemic. And that ended up settling, and I think many are describing that settling path continuing to a level that is slower, but I think healthy. So firms are describing things like, it used to be that anything I put on the shelves, customers would buy at any price because they would be worried that I would run out of whatever the things are. Suddenly now things are normalized. I'm having to articulate value to my customers. If I want to raise price, I have to really make it clear that I'm raising price because the value of the things I'm selling are going up. Customers are doing more price comparisons. They're expecting sales over the holiday seasons. We're kind of back to the type of consumer behavior, back to the type of business behavior that feels a little bit like what normal used to feel like. So demand is slowing, but is actually holding up remarkably well. And I think this is a really important part of the picture. This is a bit of a tangent, but I thought the Wall Street Journal, this was maybe 3 weeks ago or something, did a really fabulous piece on some shifting dynamics around who in our consumer base is actually driving the spending. And there has been, you hear about this in a broad sense, but there really has been an acceleration of the concentration of spending power in the country. I'm going to actually update that. It's not just spending power, it's actually spending, period, among higher earning households. So we now have the top 10% of earners make up more than half of all spending in this country, which is just remarkable. And I think for me and my team as economists and as people who think about policy, it's important for us to take that into consideration, not because monetary policy or our space is a space that is appropriate to try to change anything about that, but because it is instructive as we learn about the well-being of Americans, about how people's household finances are evolving. It's helpful that we can take that into context so we understand the big picture. One portion of this story, and folks in real estate, I'm sure know this very, very well, is wealth across income groups grew a lot early on in the pandemic. And why was that? We weren't able to go out and about and spend money on the stuff we usually would. I couldn't go to restaurants, I couldn't travel, I wasn't getting my nails done. I never get my nails done, but if I was the sort of person who would get my nails done, I wouldn't have done it. And at the same time, we were getting fiscal stimulus. There was unemployment benefits. There were all sorts of additional supports going to households. So more was coming in, less was going out. You actually saw an unprecedented gain in standard of living and well-being among the lowest income group in this economy, which is pretty unusual. That is not the place in the income segment where you tend to see the greatest acceleration in growth over the past decades. That happened during the pandemic. And then inflation ticked up. And I think for me, this really grounds why, inflation is something we can talk about in theory, but over time, its power to impact and erode American spending power is why I spend so much time thinking about it and why I am very convinced that I agree with the Fed's mandate to focus on inflation, even in times when it means we have to make tough trade-offs. Even when interest rates are high to a point that it is restraining activity in other spaces, because we know inflation can eat away at the well-being and spending power of Americans. But interestingly, so what we've seen is, and it makes sense practically, at the same time that you have seen inflation kind of draw down wealth of the majority of Americans, our wealthiest portion of our population actually has held up quite well. So why is that? You own assets. You're exposed to equity markets. You know, when home prices increase, your wealth goes up. That's very different than when home prices increase and you're a renter. So you ended up seeing this kind of bifurcation in impact across different income segments during the pandemic, in the years following the pandemic. Labor market, I mentioned this. We've seen a slowing of labor market activity. This slide is just a kind of broad conglomeration of labor market indicators sort of across a variety of activities. It's slowed. It's a diffusion index. Is it a diffusion index? I actually don't know if it's a diffusion index. I know that you can compare current levels plus or minus above long run average. Yeah, okay, so we're just comparing to long run average. That's easy. So we are still above the long run average, but you're seeing a meaningful kind of slowing of labor market activity, which again, it makes sense when you think about the story of consumer demand, that's sort of a normalization or stabilization, that we should be moving back to what would be kind of typical in the long run. This is an important part of the story, and I think we feel this very acutely in Nashville. I think sometimes being in Nashville, I can forget what it might feel like to be in other parts of the country, because the energy, the in-migration, the investment, the creativity just feels so palpable. This is non-farm payroll employment. So this is just sort of thousands of workers on net added on a monthly basis, but I've broken it down by industry. So government is orange. This is mostly state and local government. Nope, government's green. Healthcare and social assistance, orange. Thank you. Thank you. This is a sing-along, actually. Thank you. And it's been pretty remarkable. So, and then blue is everything else in the entire economy, all other sectors of the economy, which are historically the main action when it comes to employment. So my team and I spend a lot of time kind of looking at and reminding ourselves of this foundation as we see these incoming job numbers that have continued to be pretty remarkably strong. I mean, our estimates are that, somewhere between, I'm going to guess, 75 and 125, maybe 150,000 jobs a month are necessary just to kind of absorb growing population, right? So if you just want to have kind of equal impact, a completely balanced impact on the unemployment rate, that's kind of the regular run rate you need. So it means anything above that is squeezing labor markets tighter, and anything below that is kind of softening further. And man, we have continued month and month, again, even in the time when everyone was predicting a recession, even as we've seen a slowing of activity, this labor market has continued to add jobs at a remarkable pace. I point out the government and healthcare segments here because I think those are some that are in some ways a little bit less susceptible to traditional market forces. So the same sorts of economic cycles that might drive other behavior. You can think healthcare, a lot of that is around demographic changes. It's around sort of government mandated reimbursement rates and that sort of things. I think these are both actually areas that are very ripe for technological innovation and potentially disruption also, although it might be with a lag. So paying really close attention to this data. But here's actually where the action is when you think about standard of living. So what is real wage growth? In my world, there is nominal change. So that's like change in actual, like what's the price of something? What's the number of dollars someone's getting paid? But when I want to think about someone's well-being, it actually doesn't matter so much to me whether the number of dollars is the same as the number of dollars last year, but actually what's the spending power. And so this is inflation adjusted. So in my world, nominal is just the dollar value. Real is once you account for inflation. And so this is really good news. We saw during the pandemic, and that's when you see this big dip in real wage growth. Yes, wages were rising quickly, but inflation was rising faster. And so you had employees, you had family members, you had yourself seeing increases in your wages, and you were still finding, hold on a second, my paycheck's bigger than it's ever been, and it's not going as far as it used to. We've now been in a pretty significant period where that has reversed, where inflation has been low enough, wage growth has normalized to or maybe slightly above what was typical pre-pandemic, and you're continuing to see real spending power gains. When we talk to businesses, I talk about how I spend a lot of my time, Emily spends a lot of her time out and about around the state of Tennessee, talking with mostly folks who run businesses, community leaders, folks in higher ed, to get a sense in one-on-one conversations about what people are feeling. We balance that out by really broad survey work. So my work is, it's folksy, it's super informative, but it is just impossible for me to speak to a sort of statistically representative sample size. We balance out that really high-touch work with big surveys of businesses across the country. So I'm going to show you a few pictures of what we've been learning from businesses, especially over the past couple of weeks. And here is one thing. So I remind myself, there are two things you don't want to be like stuck in an elevator with me and have me start talking about, because I won't stop. One is inflation, and the other one is business surveys. But fun business survey fact. If you ask, this is actually true for households also. If you ask executives, is there going to be a recession this year? This very ties into this anecdote from earlier. If you ask executives about the economy, if you ask them about inflation, sort of these big things, they tend to be really bad at predicting. In fact, there doesn't actually tend to be a very close relationship with what happens and what they say at all. Welcome. I'm going to be everyone's favorite speaker by the end of this. I'm sorry. But if you ask everybody, this is the same for households actually. If you ask people about their businesses, if you ask them about their costs and their pricing power, it is a fabulous predictor of overall economic activity. And so the team that we work with at the Fed has some really fantastic surveys. They're free on our website if anyone's interested in checking them out, where they do some really creative work, asking people not just about what they expect, but here's actually where I think some of the cool action is. They get into uncertainty. And this is another thing. Like, has there ever been a time ever in your lives when you ask people, like, how uncertain are you? And they're ever like, oh, not at all. I'm totally certain. Because that's never happened. I feel like every year I go to my boss and I'm like, I'll tell you what's up, uncertainty. People love that. But how do you actually measure it, right? Like, how do you actually get into, like, is uncertainty more or less? So one of the cool things that our survey team does is they actually say, okay, so for your business, what do you think is what's the most likely demand you're going to see this year? And if you're wrong, and you miss and it's worse, what would that look like, and what likelihood would you assign to that? And if you're wrong, and it's actually better than you expect, what would that look like? And how likely is that? And so we end up actually getting business leaders to then identify what are actually kind of the range of reasonable outcomes. And you can use that as, I think, a very valuable, and this is a model that was developed at the Atlanta Fed and is now replicated not just nationally but internationally to try to gauge, okay, how can we actually get under the hood in like not just uncertainty as like we're all sitting around talking about how things are uncertain, but like, is this impacting the way you're making decisions? And so one really fascinating shift that I can't remember seeing since we've created this survey is you saw a big decline in expectations of businesses talking about their own sales in the coming year. But uncertainty kind of stayed the same. So there actually is a decent amount of certainty relative to history that people are saying, hey, I think I'm starting to see something where sales might be, and I want to say here, it is not sales declining, it is sales growth declining. So sales still growing, but at a slower pace than I had expected. We've been asking a lot about policy uncertainty because that's an area that has been identified over and over as a big, I'll actually just go there. When firms talk about what their top concern is, and I want to call this one out in particular because obviously, you know this, if I'm sitting down in a room with someone and they know I'm from the Federal Reserve, or if you receive a survey from me in your email and it's the surveys from the Federal Reserve, and you have a message you would like to share with the Federal Reserve, you might imagine that you would be more likely to say, you know what the real problem with my business is? You. Monetary policy. So one bias that we know we have in our surveys is overwhelmingly people kind of tend to steer the direction a little bit more toward the policy that we control, which is a natural human thing to do, especially if this policy that we control impacts your livelihood or your business makes sense. So that makes what's happening in this chart pretty crazy. So overwhelmingly, when businesses, and I would say these are not just direct tariff impacted businesses. Oh no. Did I take that out? Oh, no. Got it. It's the same with inflation. Business inflation expectations went up, and it is actually almost exactly the same for businesses in the goods space and businesses in the services space. So this is interesting. It's just like, as firms are talking about their own businesses, their own sales expectations, and they're saying tariffs are the greatest uncertainty, that is the case just as much for businesses that are not directly impacted by tariffs. And I'm reminded of this. I mean, my team's they're gonna start throwing things at me because I just obsess and talk about the same things over and over. You definitely don't ever want to walk through like a mall with me because I'll do the game where I'm like, what's a good, what's a service? It's like as economists, we really like to kind of cut the economy into these clean buckets, right? You are high skill and you are low skill, and this is a good business and this is a services business. I was getting my hair cut the other day, and I'm like, oh, haircuts, yep, services, I know, this is a service. And so, of course, as you can imagine is the case with everyone in my life, this poor woman has like 3.5 hours of just being interviewed by me. And I'm like, how much do you pay this person? What's your rent? Has this changed? I'm like, what's the most expensive input that you have? What's the most money that you spend on anything? I honestly didn't know this. There are some very fashionable people in this room, so I bet people actually know about this. Human hair. You can buy these like rows, and it's mostly from Southeast Asia. You can buy these rows of like, obviously then, my hair's in foils, and I'm like sitting under the thing, and then she lets me go into her closet, and I look at this huge closet of like 3-foot long human hair. Anyway, this is not a planned part of my presentation, but it was very interesting. It was very interesting, and it was a reminder. So I'm getting my hair cut and colored. I'm not going to say how much, but it was well into the 3 figures. She sells these human hairs that she then sews into people's heads for like $1,500 or more, and she's paying directly for the import costs. And so even though haircuts, as an economist, whatever, haircuts are services businesses, they're not impacted by this. She's like, oh no, actually a huge part of my sales price is directly impacted by inputs, like the chemicals I'm using, like the supplies I'm using, like this aluminum foils that are all over my hair, and like this crazy, amazing closet of very long human hair. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm becoming unhinged. Okay, back to the labor market. We're on time. Okay, labor force participation rate. This was a really big topic early on in the pandemic because we saw huge changes, a huge disruption to the way people were participating in the workforce. That has almost entirely reversed. It is actually more than totally reversed. So what we saw during the pandemic, naturally, a whole bunch of people either couldn't or didn't want to go out and about, attend their work in person, their work was closed, whatever it was. You saw a huge decline in labor force participation. So in this country, we consider you participating in the labor force if you're either working for pay, this includes gig workers or consultants, self-employed people, or if you are actively looking for a job. And you can self-report this. And we ended up, so in the years following the depths of the pandemic, I mean, we all remember this very acutely if you remember like waiting in line to, have a seat at a restaurant or, all of the various ways that it seems like every business in our lives was understaffed. There was just an incredible labor force shortage. And a very large portion of this, a big impact leading to this, was a persistent decline in labor force participation, specifically among people 55 and older. And while you have seen a reversion to pre-pandemic kind of behavior, in fact, it's funny, nowadays people want to talk, you still hear the kids these days don't want to work. And I'm like, oh wait, actually our population is participating in the workforce, the 25 to 54 group, which is kind of historically the group that has been most engaged. It's kind of our biggest chunk of workers. They're participating more than ever. More than since, as long as we've had this data. The big change here continues to be people 55 and older. And actually, the big change within that group is people in their late 60s and older. But a part of the interesting dynamic is actually, this is not the weird period. The way people are choosing when, at what time in their lives, at what junctures they are opting out of working, actually looks really similar to how people behaved in the 90s, in the early 2000s. The unusual period was immediately following the financial crisis, when you saw people who otherwise, their employers year after year in 2016 and 17 and 18 and 19 were saying watch out, we are about to have a huge labor force shortage because each year the average age of my workforce goes up a year. And I do not have apprentices, I do not have kind of young people coming in ready to take the helm. And it just never happened. I mean, there were years I was doing this work and I would go to my boss and be like, watch out, this is about to be crazy. All of these people, there's gonna be a huge retirement wage, it's gonna be massive impact on wage growth. And at first, my boss listened to me and then he stopped listening to me because I was just always wrong. So that helps to form a pattern. But here's a good thing about being wrong. If you stick with it, sometimes, eventually you're right. All you need is a pandemic. So we ended up having this big disruption. I mean, it was hard to remember, like an actual global health crisis that for some reason or another, a lot of people sort of speculate as to why, you basically ended up seeing a complete reversion back to the workforce behavior that you would have seen pre-financial crisis. And my expectation, so there's a lot of theories about this is my own personal expectation, is that I don't see this reversing. I don't see some big trend. Again, I actually would tie this all the way back to the earlier slide about wealth and incomes, because you know who also tends to be most exposed to assets? Older Americans. And tends to have benefited from some of the kind of increase in value assets that we've seen. And so drawing those people back into the workforce just seems less and less likely to me. And so to some extent, as we think about the future, as we think about employment and inflation, the things that the Fed focuses on, this always happens. I was like, I'm going to finish early. We're going to have Q&A, and I'm not. Okay, hold on. Let's just go to this part. The Fed funds rate, the Fed's tool. So our rate, as people in this room have been very graciously kind to me about, but I know it hurts me too. I'm in the market. I'm looking for a house for my dad is moving down to Tennessee, and I'm like, wait a second. Payments on this house that 2 years ago would have been so much lower. It is wild and it hurts. And I know you feel that. And in some ways, the policy was, in fact, kind of designed to feel that way. I mean, the Fed was given one tool by Congress. And inflation is too high. And it isn't a tool that doesn't have, just like I think in all ways when the public sector intervenes to try to impact the economy, it's a really blunt instrument. It's hard to impact just a particular market and not others. That is not the authority that the Federal Reserve has. And so we have continued to hold interest rates after bringing them down since late summer last year, have continued to hold them in part because of all of this uncertainty. Because we are hearing kind of mixed messages about what might inflation do in the coming year. We've seen expectations, businesses saying there's expectations for rising inflation pressure, but when we look at the data, it's not really showing up yet. And similarly, when we ask them about employment growth, about demand growth, what we're being told is that there's expectations for a slowing. But we're still not seeing it in the hard data. And so the current thinking, and you've heard Chair Powell say this publicly, you've heard my boss, Raphael Bostic, talk about this is a time when what we don't want to do is create more uncertainty in the market by getting out ahead of where the economy actually goes and making a decision that we would have to reverse longer term. So we are absolutely aware of both the benefit and the kind of contractionary force that our policy can have. And our expectation, this came out, another one's going to come out in a month and a half or so, but in March, the expectation is that hopefully we're able to do 2 more decreases for funds rates this year. But I think the uncertainty, the various factors that could impact those decisions are particularly wide. If I were filling out a business survey, which maybe when I leave the Fed, this is one of my goals, maybe they'll email me and I'll get to tell them about my uncertainty and the probabilities of the various, it would be the most detailed response they've ever gotten. And I actually can know that for sure because I read the responses. That we are just in a period of exceptional uncertainty and kind of happy to have a discussion about it, but I am personally grounded, and it gives me a lot of faith working with a team and working with an organization that is honest about the uncertainty and is open to receiving new information and kind of changing course if necessary. And I think that's the kind of moment we're in, that the economy is just evolving really rapidly, and we have forces that are in motion that I don't think have settled where they're likely to be long term, and giving the economy time to play out and give us some clear signals about what we can do to achieve that dual mandate, to bring inflation down, and also to do that in a way that is still supportive of broader economic growth, of the broader employment markets, I think is really important. Okay, do I have time for, I don't, but can we do at least one question anyway? You could get up and have snacks and go to the bathroom if you need, but yes, thank you.
What's the likelihood, in your opinion, of stagflation, and how long would it last, and what would be the tools to make it go away?
Whew. Okay, wow. That was a big, I said one question. That was, you like really gave me, we're going to be going right into the next speaker because this will be a 14-minute answer. The question was about stagflation. So for those of you who don't spend as much time trapping people in elevators talking about inflation and surveys as I do, stagflation is this concept of, is there a period where you could have high inflation and a recession or really low growth? And that's really different than what we tend to have. So inflation tends to go hand in hand with strong growth. So part of this is, what do you have if our tool is actually, if both of these parts of our mandates are missing at the same time? I think there are a number of impacts here. I mean, I personally am not, I am not placing a very high likelihood on that outcome. And I think part of this is a question of time horizon, right? There can be shocks to the economy, or there can be periods where you might see these two things moving together. But I personally am grounded in, like, I talked about real wages. I'm gonna use another like dopey economics term, like economic fundamentals, I think are actually where the action is, right? You can have all of these outside forces. We're hearing a lot about the impact of tariff policy or fiscal policy right now, about immigration policy and what that might mean for workforce. I'm actually grounded in like, okay, this is all happening on the surface, and it's real. It's impacting businesses, it's impacting livelihoods, it's impacting well-being. So I don't want to dismiss it as unreal. But what I want to know is, like, what's the ocean doing beneath it? And when I look at the well-being of the American consumer, when I look at the well-being of American businesses, when I see global uncertainty or geopolitical uncertainty, and I continue to see global investors say, I would like to invest my money in American businesses, in American debt, I want dollars, I think it gets me to a point where I want to listen to the voices. I want to understand the voices of the pundits. I think we should be doing risk planning and scenario planning around worst case scenarios and what might happen if things turn in a way that's big and impacts the fundamentals. But I also want to kind of go beneath the storytelling to what's actually happening. And I have been really heartened and have been sleeping better, I would say even in particular over the past couple of weeks, as I both see in the data and I hear from businesses saying, yes, some of these changes hurt, but we're figuring out a way to manage them. We are seeing consumers respond to higher prices. We're pushing back some of the tariff pressure back onto suppliers. We're seeing customers, in some cases, have to make kind of tough decisions. But still, the broader resiliency of the American workforce and the American consumer still seem to be there. Okay, someone's got to rein me in because I could actually keep taking up time. Am I allowed to do one more? Okay, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments about what you shared, and specifically with the consumer, right? So you talked about the strength of the consumer. We've got credit card debt at an all-time high right now, over $1 trillion. You've got buy now, pay later programs that are reaching heights, and some of that is groceries. So when we talk about what you shared and the strength of the economy, and you're talking really top level with a lot of business owners that are giving you these forecasts, not boots on the ground, people that have families to feed and things of that nature. And so that's some of the concern I have with what the Fed is looking at and doing when it comes to this, because that to me is like the writing on the wall when you've got people that are doing buy now, pay later. Now, some people can get out of that because they have access to home equity because they own their homes, and we talk about assets. Yeah. But those that don't, that want to hopefully own one day, are stuck. They're not in that position. You had the PPI report come out this morning. It was negative 0.5%. That, is typically, isn't that the Fed's favorite measure of inflation? So you have these things that are showing that's coming down, and it seems to me like interest rates are too high with where they are on that chart that you showed. Interest rates on a 30-year fixed, that gap has widened even though that's come down. So the spread is still too large. Yeah. And so these are things that seem like it's time. Now, I think for the Atlanta Fed or Raphael Bostic, like for where you're at, you guys might be open to these types of suggestions. It seems like Jerome Powell is not. So it just seems like he's very, focused on the wait and see, but it seems like a lot of the data is pointing to like we should probably be proactive and look to lower. So
Thank you. I know that was a comment, but I feel like because I'm on the stage, maybe can I make some comments in response? I absolutely agree. I think especially about your comment around the strain facing low-income Americans. And this is a little bit of a challenge for me personally in wearing a Fed hat, because the Federal Reserve is not charged with making decisions about sort of the distribution of wealth or well-being in the economy. And in my personal view, it should not be charged with those things. The Fed, you as a taxpayer and as a voter, I personally want people who I elect. I want people making decisions about distribution between who gets what policies to support them, how might we want to redistribute well-being, what groups, whether it's households or businesses, who is struggling, how do we want to make decisions collectively about taking something from some and sharing with others. Like, I think those are very important conversations, and they tie closely into like my personal human values. The Fed was not charged with that, and my personal belief is the Fed should not be using interest rates to try to target specific groups, that it can be incredibly distortionary to use this really broad tool that impacts everybody to try to give relief to a particular income segment, for example. I would also say, this concern about slowing demand, I also really feel, and you see this, in fact, it's actually been a bit unusual to see slowing employment overall, but actually a lot of where the strain is higher income groups right now. I think my own theory is that there's some AI disruption stuff happening for jobs like mine, actually. What I would say is, and we know this, it is incredibly expensive to be poor in this country. Folks at the lowest end of the income spectrum tend to be hit first and worst when demand slows. That is also true with inflation. That is also the group that allowing inflation to run above our target for too long impacts those most vulnerable Americans first. So, I could not agree more that I think it is really important for us to understand and study, and I think shine a light on people who are feeling strains from all sides right now. And I say this wearing my Fed hat, and I also say this as as an individual taking off my Fed hat. There are really good tools to address those issues, and in my view, those tools sit with elected officials who are and should be directly accountable to voters, and not to sort of this broad quasi-governmental institution that doesn't really have those same tools. Okay, thank you.